Chapter 18, Consumption and Savings. This is the most important chapter. I'll tell you why. United States GDP, the biggest in the whole world, 70% of that is explained by consumption. So the consumption factors in 70% of the GDP of the United States. Similarly, in India, in 2010, 50% of India's GDP was through consumption. Right now, in 2020, it's close to 60%. Still 10% lower than the United States, but you know where it's going. Consumption, if you understand how people consume, what makes them consume, then you understand the majority of the GDP. So there are a lot of theories that are built that explain consumption. We're going to look at 6 of them. Started off with Irving Fisher in 1950s and John Maynard Keynes. They introduced this concept of intertemporal choice as to how consumers think of spending not just today but also in the future. And then Keynesian consumption function said, hey, people consume, but they don't consume everything that they earn, they save. And then there was this Milton Friedman post 1950s when he said, hey, there's this permanent income hypothesis where he introduced this concept of there's a difference between income that is permanent and there's an income that is temporary. And people weighing on the permanent income more. And then on top was built this life cycle hypothesis where people said, hey, people smooth out. They want to spend income for this entire life that they have. So that was by Franco Modigliani. And then the 5th one, which was a random walk, very recently, 1980s, by Robert Hall, where he said, hey, all of this can be questionable because consumptions actually follow a random variable like behavior, wherein you reduce tax and expect that consumptions will be boosted. That doesn't necessarily happen. So he said consumption follows a random walk. And then the most recent behavioral economics, where there's this concept of instant gratification where people discount the future way more, make wrong choices. So there are these 6 different theories that we're going to look at, and we're going to build on each one of them one by one. So let's look at the first one, the intertemporal choice by Irving Fisher, 1950s. He introduced this concept called IBL, intertemporal budget line. It's a line that shows that in period 1, you will consume C1, and in period 2, you will consume C2. It's basically introducing this concept that consumers are forward-looking. They not only consume today, but they know that, hey, they're going to live next year and the year after. They want to consume equally well in the next year. So they know that if they have C1, then in the next year they'll consume C2, and you can draw a line. You can draw a line that says, hey, if I consume more this year, then I'll consume less next year, right? So this line based on how you consume shifts. The slope of the line shifts. And then there's this new concept that we've already seen previously that can be added on, which is the indifference curve, which basically says for a consumer, consuming less of C1, less of these items, and more of these items is okay, or consuming equal amounts of both of these is okay, or consuming more of this item versus less of this item is okay in this year and then the following year. So there's an indifference, meaning any point on this curve, consumer is okay, saying, hey, I'm fine. And so the optimal consumption happens if you join these two. If the IBL becomes tangent to the IC curve, then this is the optimal consumption choice, wherein there's maximum utilization, maximum satisfaction for the consumer. So with these 2 concepts, the intertemporal budget line, which basically says you have a budget, and your budget, you're going to have 2 periods, today and next year, and you want to evolve and spend only that much that you need, right? And you want to optimize for the next year as well, right? Because if you consume more this year, right, the budget line looks like this, right? You will have to consume less here and more here, right? And so this same IBL line can be drawn into these 3 phases. Phase 1, this is the phase where you can lend money because your optimal is here. Let's say it's $50,000 is your consumption. But you can borrow and spend all of these. You can maybe go to $80,000. What that means is that you will then spend very little in the next year. So this is that point where there is no lending, no borrowing. But if you consume less, then you can actually lend that money and consume more in the next year, right? So there are these three phases of this line, IBL line. This phase is the lending. This is the point where you don't lend and don't borrow, and this is the phase where you borrow into the future. So assuming interest rate as 10%, this line can be drawn this way, right? So there are two really interesting observations here, right? First is that the IBL line is downward sloping. It has a slope of 1 minus r, 1 plus r, minus of 1 plus r, which r is the interest rate, which basically says if interest rate goes up, right? If my interest rate goes up, it will have an impact on my consumption, right? And so even this if you see, there's a convexity here, right? Which basically says that, hey, at some point, I'm not going to be willing to give up so much for this year's period, right? At this point, if you see, the slope is, there's the margin of reduction for this year is reducing. Here you can see that, hey, there is a lot more reduction. But basically, the convexity here says that, hey, there is marginal. You can only go so much, but you will need some amount of spending in this year, right? So that's why there's convexity. And then you can also see that there's this attraction towards the center, right? Which basically is the smoothing effect. People want to spend money in some predictable fashion that is regular. They don't want to spend $100,000 one year and then $5,000 next year. Maybe they would want to spend $55,000 one year and $55,000 second year. So these are good, important things to remember, that consumptions slowly go up. They don't go up rapidly. And that's why there is this convexity, and there's also bowed towards the center, right? This curve, right? So once we understand the intertemporal budget line and we understand the indifference curve and where the optimal choice is, now let's look at two different effects, income effect and substitution effect. So let's say your income increases. So you just get a 10% raise because you did an MBA. Every year, now you know there's an increase to your wealth. So what happens? Your IBL line, which was this line, parallelly moves forward. So it just went up. So what happens is your consumption went up in the current year, and your consumption also went up in the future year, right? You see this? So if your income increases or your wealth increases, your IBL line just shifts to the right. And so your optimal quantity also shifts up from O1 to O1 dash, right? For these two indifference curves. So that's pretty straightforward. If you have a higher income, higher wealth, people are going to spend more. Similarly, there's also a substitution effect when there is, let's say, an interest rate goes up. Let's say today's interest rate is 0%, but the Federal Reserve says, hey, next year's interest rate, we're going to continuously go up, and it's going to be 4%. So then people get the signal saying, hey, if I save more, I can get that 4% interest. So what happens is when interest rate goes up, the year the interest rate goes up, the consumption drops, right? Because people are saving more. But the following year, consumption goes up. So, and the way it happens is if this was the line, the IBL line before, and this was the no borrow, no lend point, then it's going to pivot on this point. It's going to go up, right? It's going to go up. So then the IBL line becomes this one. And so you saw that the consumption went down in period 1, went up in period 2, right? And so that is the substitution effect, where you substituted current consumption for the next year's consumption because you're going to get more of it from the interest. So now you understand the income effect, consumption on income effect, and wealth effect on consumption. You also understand the substitution effect. But which one's higher? You might ask the question like, hey, if my income's going up as a country, but there's also interest rates going up, like which one's going higher? Will my consumption actually drop, or will my consumption go up? It's difficult to tell, right? And that's why we will learn some more of these theories, and we'll probably can find out. But as a general rule of thumb, substitution effects is always higher than the income effect. Meaning, if the interest rate goes up, people will save more. That's through data. That's real data that's available. But it's hard to show that empirically, right? So now, but what happens if there is a case where the person who's trying to spend more but cannot spend because they have a borrowing constraint? Let's say they can only, their income is lower, their optimal quantity is higher. In that case, what happens is the IBL line is a clipped line, right? This is the IBL line. Ideally, the IBL line would have been here. They would have had O1 quantities, but now their indifference curve shifts from IC1 to IC2. It shifts down because they're making less money. So even if the person knows that they're going to make more money, they cannot really borrow because they have a clipped IBL line. Their current income limits them to spend more, right? So borrowing constraint, what happens is your consumption is equal to the income that you make, even though you know you can make more into the future. So now, but the opposite, where you're consuming less than your income, then there is no constraint. You can have optimal quantity. So you have to decide at what point, what is your IBL line? Is it the optimal line, or is it a clipped line based on the number of people in the country who actually have borrowing constraints? So that gives us a lens of thinking about, like, hey, are people having borrowing constraints? And so my IBL line would shift in a very different way. So that was the contribution by Irving Fisher by creating this intertemporal choice of consumption. Once we understand that, we're just going to add on to it Keynesian consumption function, which is C equals C bar plus MPC times Y. MPC is marginal propensity to consume, and Y is the income. C bar is you can think about it as autonomous consumption, and C is the consumption function. So marginal propensity to consume is basically saying, hey, if I make $1, will I spend it all? What Keynesian consumption function says that MPC is going to be less than 1, it's going to be between 0 and 1. So which makes sense. You're going to save some amount, unless you're maybe clipped and you wanted to spend. So you can at most spend 1. So basically, it gives us this lens of thinking that, hey, if my income increases, my consumption increases, right? If my Y goes up, consumption goes up, right? That's also a good, I would say that's also a good takeaway, which is if my income increases, my consumption increases, right? And MPC is between 0 and 1, how much people consume. But there's also this really good learning which says, hey, if income increases, at some point, you're going to start increasing your savings too. Because there's only so much that you can spend. So all of this is going to be saving, because you're going to be having higher income, but you're not going to be spending all of that. So savings increase as well as income increases. And when income increases, consumption to income ratio falls, right? Because there's only so much that you can consume. So that was Keynesian contribution. Both of them were created at the same time. There is lots of things in common, as you can tell. Marginal propensity to consume. As income goes up, consumption goes up. That's the income effect. So there's lots of commonality between the intertemporal budget line, which is very similar. If you see, there's lots of similarities between what Keynesian consumption function says and what the intertemporal budget line and the concept that we look through with substitution effect, income effect happens, right? So both substitution and income effect can be explained by Keynesian as well. But the key new thing is savings goes up when income goes up, right? And like what we heard here, as income goes up, wealth goes up, consumption goes up. As interest rate goes up, current year consumption goes down, future year consumption goes up. For your clipped borrowing constrained people, consumption is clipped at their income. So once we understand these two, there's a third one, which is the permanent income hypothesis, which was developed by Milton Friedman. So that's this area. What he contributed was that the consumption is dependent on the permanent income. He added this new concept that says, hey, there is this permanent income and temporary income. If I have a tax cut, I know that it's one time, then I'm going to count it as part of my temporary income and not my permanent income. So this concept that people are forward looking, and then they know how much they're going to make over their lifetime, how much they're going to save up to their retirement. And so there's this concept of permanent income that's more important. So he says consumption is C, capital C is equal to C times YP, where small c is the marginal propensity to consume of the YP, which is permanent income. So he introduced this new concept saying, hey, it's not just one or two periods, it's not just like what my total income is, it's actually just my permanent income that you have to think of, not just like my total income. And so he said permanent income is more important. And based on this, right, the way to look at how is the sentiment of people's feeling of their permanent income, there's this report, Consumer Confidence Report, which is a leading indicator that tells you what is the consumer's confidence of their permanent income. It asks them 5 questions, 5,000 or so survey recipients, and it asks them like, hey, how do you think about the business investments? How do you think about their savings and things like that, which gives you consumer confidence. Because if the consumer confidence goes up, right, then their aggregate demand goes up. Right? We've seen this in aggregate demand in micro classes, that if your aggregate demand goes up, your output goes up, inflation also goes up, right? So consumer sentiment is a leading indicator of the permanent income that people feel that they have, and that people make choices based on permanent income, not total income. And it's not just 2 periods. So that was the addition that he added. And the example in the textbook that's really good, which says, hey, if you get an MBA and you get a raise of 10% after completing your MBA, you know that's your permanent income. But if you go to Las Vegas and get $10,000 because you hit a jackpot, it's your temporary income. So you will not change as overall aggregate consumers your consumption based on temporary income, but it's only going to be permanent income. So that was a contribution by Milton Friedman. And then the final one, the life cycle hypothesis. This was by Franco Modigliani, right? He said that people think about consumption from their entire life cycle, right? He says people start saving until their retirement, and then they do this saving, meaning they eat into their savings. So people have this lifetime resources concept, meaning they think about their entire life cycle, and then they think about their entire life when it comes to how much they should consume, right? And so he came up with a consumption function that looks like this. C equals small w times wealth, W, plus C times Y. So he says consumption is dependent on your overall wealth and your income. So he introduced this new concept of wealth, right, which is how much aggregate savings you have built up that you're going to eat into. And if you're not saving enough, that actually you're going to not consume much. So he added this concept of lifetime, retirement, and the concept of wealth. He's like, hey, your savings, it's important. People think about that because they know at some point they're not going to be able to make money and they want to eat into their investments. So consumption drops with drop in wealth, right? So if people have a lot of their savings invested in, let's say, stock market or their home, and if the home prices decline or the stock markets decline, then their savings is going to take a dip. If their savings is going to take a dip, or their investments are going to take a dip, their wealth is going to take a dip. If their wealth is going to take a dip, even if they have an income that's steady, permanent income that's steady, dude, it's going to go down. Consumption is going to go down. So he added another layer on top of like what Milton Friedman added, saying, hey, even if you just look at your permanent income, but your overall wealth is an important layer in terms of thinking of consumption. So he added one more. And so then the fifth one was very recent by Robert Hall at Stanford University, 1978. He said, hey, he said all of these things, you know, all of these things, which is like, you know, you want to have consumption in this year, next year, you want to have your savings go up, you want to think about your permanent income, you want to think about your wealth. All of these things are already factored in. He's like, hey, unless there's a new surprise, meaning let's say you knew the government always does tax cuts, or this new party comes in power, they always do this and that. So then people already discount that. So he's like, hey, if there are no surprises, if there are no big surprises, then all of these things really don't change things, because people have already factored in, like they already know where they live, they already know the government, they already know the investments, they already know from the generations that their families have as to how this country is doing. So he's saying only unanticipated new information, that's not all of these things, and surprises is what changes the consumption behavior. If there's always a 5% tax cut by a Republican Party, and if they suddenly do a 25% tax cut, something like that, something big, then that permanently shifts the consumption in a positive way. But if they always do 5% and this time they did 2%, then actually that has a negative impact, right? So basically, he's saying, and given that surprises are like random variables, like you can't really predict, he's like, consumption follows a random path, a random walk. So that was the random walk hypothesis by Robert Hall. And finally, the behavioral economics. This is very, very new, very interesting field, which I'm super excited to get into, which is instant gratification is luring people away from making right long-term decisions. And so while we can understand all of these theory, like think about how many people on this planet actually take an economics course or actually think about all of these areas. The theories that's happening here in behavioral economics saying, hey, people are discounting the future way too much. They don't even think about like C2 and retirement and then savings, and forget about all of that. He's like, behavioral economics says instant gratification is actually making people make wrong choices. And so consumers are not even saving, they're not looking into the future, and then they're probably, when they get some raise, they're overreacting and spending way too much. And it gives a really good example in the textbook. When you see a banana split with hot fudge ice cream, you go for it, even though when you know you shouldn't be eating it. Social media and other pieces, right, where there may be some actions which get you to instant gratification, like second day delivery in Amazon, right? You can get it, you can just go to the store and get it much cheaper. We just click the button, you have it delivered, right? So this eats into your savings. And so all of these factors, understanding how consumers are adapting and changing their behavior, and how that changes their economics is very important, because there could be some incentives for the government to have automatic savings or automatic enrollment in 401k. There could be some nudge that can be used to actually get the consumers to follow the right long-term path, so that they can be first literate and then they make the right choices. Right now the problem is they're not making the right choices. So hopefully these 6 different layers, we've added one after the other, and this is just the beginning in terms of how we understand the majority part of the GDP, which is consumption. If we get this right, and if we can understand how the consumers consume, what is the probability that they'll borrow, they'll not borrow, they'll save more, how they are actually thinking about their retirements, where are their retirements in, how are they behaving, what is the next set of generations, what surprises are coming in, how things are changing, will have a big impact on consumption and savings. If you understand consumption, savings is just the other part. Or if you understand savings, consumption is the other part, because savings plus consumption equals disposable income. So hopefully we understand savings with a little bit more, and we can build on this for the future. Thanks.